All right, so again, this is the Louisiana Climate Initiative's Task Force talk, where we have two members of the Louisiana, the task force, here today to talk to us about what we've been working on this last year, what we're going to be continuing to do, and how we hope to implement some of these suggestions that the task force is going to be pulling together. But first, I want to give you a little overview of Clean Cities. If you've been at all of our sessions so far, this will be a repeat for you, so I will be brief. Clean Cities is a Department of Energy program. There are approximately 80 coalitions across the country where we work together with fleets and community leaders and to educate consumers as well about alternative fuel vehicles and technologies and techniques to reduce our transportation emissions. And if you're in an area where there is no Clean Cities Coalition, you can call one nearby you and you'll find that they're more than happy to help out. So where do Clean Cities Coalitions fit within the Department of Energy? Well, within the Department of Energy, there's the Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Division, and the Vehicle Technology Office is underneath that. And then right here, under the VTO is technology integration, and that is where we sit within the VTO. And Clean Cities Coalitions, a lot of us are independent nonprofits. Some of us are hosted in state energy offices, planning commissions and such, or even within universities. But all of us have the same mission, which is to help reduce transportation emissions through alternative fuel use, domestic alternative fuel use, energy efficient mobility systems, better practices such as route optimization, reducing vehicle miles traveled, idle reduction, anything that reduces our transportation fuel use and miles driven. So today's presenters, we're hoping Lindsay will be able to join with us, but she has been unavoidably detained for a moment. But we will move on without her for a little while as we hope for her to be able to try and join us. First of all, we also have Dr. Chuck Carr-Brown, who is Secretary of Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality, and Camille Manning-Broom, President and CEO, Center for Planning of Excellence. And Camille is going to be taking over Lindsay's role until Lindsay's able to join us if she is. So Camille?
Yeah, great. Hi, it's great to be with all of you today. And I am going to deliver Lindsay's PowerPoint presentation and overview. Maybe not as well as she would. These are her slides, but I'll get us through. The climate executive order that our governor, John Bel Edwards, signed is enormously critical for the future of our state. And he set forth goals for the task force to achieve in its recommendations. Those goals are to reduce emissions from the 2005 levels by 26 to 28% by 2025, 40 to 50% of those 2005 levels by 2030, and by 2050 be net zero. The 2005 levels are the benchmark because at the signing of the executive order, that was the latest inventory on emissions that we had. However, the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities and the Secretary Brown, have been working with LSU to develop a new emissions inventory, which will be presented at our next task force meeting in July. Next slide. So where we are in the timeline, we started in November 2020. We got a little late start because of COVID, but we've been working tirelessly. There's over 150 individuals involved in either the task force or its subcommittees. We've had public participation and ability for the public to weigh in, not only on all of the meetings, but also within the cross sector and other committee meetings. And we have submitted all of our recommendations. They're going into decision-making model and matrix to provide different pathways for the state of Louisiana. We have, you can see on the timeline, several more task force meetings. We'll have a special meeting in August to specifically focus on industrial decarbonization and the path to get there. And with all of that, we'll produce a final report in February of 2022. So as I mentioned, over 145 experts are part of the task force or one of its committees. The task force was appointed by the governor, and then it was we're supported by 4 different advisory groups. Those advisory groups are specifically focusing on equity, science, finance, and legal. So all of the recommendations, the work, go through those 4 lenses, which are really critical and how we're determining our pathways. And then we have very specific sector committees, which each have a chair member from the task force and a co-chair. That's agriculture, forestry, conservation, and waste, land use, building, and housing, and I'm the co-chair on that. Power distribution, power production, distribution, and use, mining and oil and gas, transportation, manufacturing, and industry. And we can go through. I've already said all of that in that first slide. And I would be remiss to mention the enormous work being done by the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities staff. They are part of the planning team in addition to the Water Institute, who is in, organizing all of this, providing the logistics support, also thought leadership, making the connections, and helping put together the final plan that all will be a result of the recommendations by those 150 individuals dedicating time to this, plus the public input. And I'll just continue to move forward from here. I think the big piece here is that there's going to be a high level vision, but what's really critical for us in Louisiana, this is such a complicated conversation and discussion, and I'm so grateful that we're having this public discourse on it, because we've got real challenges ahead of us and meeting these goals. But with the people around the table and the coming together of all this diverse groups, we're able to create a high level vision and then developing portfolios, which will be a comprehensive set of strategies and actions to take to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And so in each portfolio, there will be a number of strategies and then action items under that. So it's going to explicitly lay out and be more representative of an action plan, not just big, bold recommendations on the Louisiana should do this. It's going to be more concrete than that. We received 101 action ideas, and you can see on the left side, what buckets they fell into. This was really great. They not only came from members of the committees, but also from the public. All of those are have been provided to the committee chairs and are being discussed across the committees. You can imagine that there's a lot of overlap between land use, transportation, power distribution, agriculture and forestry and transportation. So there's a lot of cross-sector discussion happening now as well. Right now, each of the committees are adding on, providing more details where there are gaps in the recommendations, and then they will be part of a decision-making process and model that's being created. So the timeline, just the big picture is, you can see that we're in June. We had our task force meeting. Our next meeting is in July. I encourage you all to zoom in and listen. And then we'll have additional advisory group meetings to really look through those 4 lenses that I mentioned on all of the action items that rise to the top. We'll have a special task force meeting in August, September, specifically focused on industrial decarbonization. And then we'll resume with our sector committees to fine tune any details of the recommendations that rise to the top of meeting all the guiding principles of the task force. And then you can see more task force meetings in October and November to really deliberate and finalize what the task force is going to recommend to the governor, and then approving a final report, hopefully in January, February. How to learn more? This website and link always provides you with not just the information, but how you can listen in, you can participate. We were having the majority of our meetings via Zoom, but now they're being held in the Capitol, and so everyone is welcome to attend there as well. All of the information will always be included on this site. Next slide. And this is for the later presentation. So, Secretary Brown, did I leave off anything?
No, actually, Camille, you did an outstanding job of kind of covering all of the basics of the task force. And so I just look forward to kind of maybe just expounding on some of the items and answering some questions that may come our way. So I guess, Ann, we'll go back to you.
Yeah, so I have the questions that Lindsay had prepared so well for all of you. And just want to mention that I am on the transportation subcommittee, and to let everybody know, we have all, even in our subcommittees, have been working really hard on those suggestions on that big sheet, that the action template. And we had a lot of stakeholders participating with us. So we really thank all of our stakeholders for pulling together and helping us get a good deal of those 36 transportation suggestions in there. Okay, so can you start off, both of you, by explaining the role of transportation emissions in Louisiana's overall emissions profile, and how do these emissions in Louisiana differ from the nation as a whole?
So Camille, you go ahead and then I'll fill in the gap.
Yeah, and Lindsay was going to have us talk a little bit high level first, but we can go straight into the questions if you like.
Hey, Lindsay.
Hi guys, hi everyone. I'm so sorry for being late.
That's right. We just finished with your overview, and so I jumped right into one of the questions when we were supposed to have a little bit of a high level overview first. So maybe we can jump in right there. So first, let me let y'all know, Lindsay is a policy advisor for the Louisiana Governor's Office of Coastal Activities, with a focus in strategic planning, interagency alignment, and intergovernmental coordination on state priorities regarding climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. So she is one of the project managers on this task force that all of us in all the subcommittees and on the task force itself, we go through her. So she's been a very busy lady, keeping us all organized and keeping us on task. So I will pitch it back to you, Lindsay.
Yes, thank you, Anne, for that introduction. And I appreciate everyone being here today. And I apologize for being late myself. I was in another meeting and had the wrong time. So I'm really excited to be with you all today at the Clean Fuel Summit.
Fantastic. So we just started talking about the role of transportation emissions in Louisiana overall. And was there something that you would want to set us up with, Lindsay, before we go into answering that question?
Thanks for teeing that question up, Anne. I would just preface with Louisiana's emission profile is a little bit different than most of our other states. And if we look at the national scale, Louisiana also looks a little bit different. A lot of other states are looking at transportation as their biggest section of emissions, but in Louisiana, it's a little bit different. So I'd love to hear from Camille and Dr. Brown on how they have interpreted that, and as members of our task force are using Louisiana's unique strengths and differences as we're planning for this climate action plan.
Yeah, and so, you know, the majority of our emissions, I guess the most recent estimates, 66% are from industrial oil and gas. However, the second highest source of our emissions are 19% from the transportation sector. And when you look across the United States, most states are grappling with their highest emissions coming from transportation. But as it is 19%, it's still an area for lots of improvement, especially if we are to get to net zero. And so from a standpoint, in terms of transit and changing not only, you know, the ways that we reduce emissions through this sector, we're going to have to move to electric stations, which are fueled by renewables, and to change our modes of transportation so that we provide more options so that people don't have to use a personal vehicle to get around. In order to have transit as a viable alternative, we're going to have to change our development patterns. And we're going to have to stop sprawl and turn inward into our metropolitan areas to build more density instead and invest in regional transit services. You cannot have transit services without a real, viable options as transit services without density. I think these, from our perspective of working in a multitude of rural and urban places across the state, it's much harder to change these development patterns. But we're definitely seeing a desire from individuals, especially in our more urban areas. They're wanting options to get around. They're wanting to be able to bike and walk and have bus rapid transit and intercity rail between the metropolitan areas. And so, change doesn't happen overnight, but when you start prioritizing different ways that your communities are designed and different options that your communities provide so that you can not only attract individuals from elsewhere, but keep our youth and keep people here, we're going to have to think differently about the design of our communities. And so not only is it critical to move to electric vehicles, it's also critical to start focusing on changing our development patterns.
Yeah, and I'd like to chime in on that also. So just to give everybody a little higher level view about how this task force actually came about, and some discussions that we've been having for quite a long time. Here in Louisiana, the governor and I, starting in 2016, as a result of the monies we got from the Volkswagen settlement, started to talk about, diversifying and relying on an overall integrated energy strategy. So we petitioned the Federal Highway Administration. We've created alternative fuel corridors, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. But ultimately, at a retreat we had in 2019, we were just discussing, how do we address the issues of climate from a good policy standpoint, a good government standpoint. And one of the things that I said was, regardless of what your political outlook is regarding climate change, nobody in that room could deny we had sea level rise, and we got subsidence, and we got more storms, more frequent storms, more intense storms, and that something has to be done to address that issue. And of course, in February of 2020 is when the governor created this climate initiative task force. When you start looking at the overall profile, on average, you would say that 27% of your greenhouse gas, 28% of your greenhouse gas emissions would come from transportation. 27% would be from electric generating units, and 22% would come from industry, and then 12 to 15% would be agriculture. When you start looking at the numbers, and I anxiously await the new inventory numbers, but what I'm hearing is that 22% on average from industry is going to look more like 66%. And then you just heard that 28% would be more like 19 from a transportation standpoint. And then as we look at Louisiana from an electric generating standpoint, on average, we have about 18% of our electricity that comes from coal-fired units. Those numbers are going to start to drop off pretty dramatically as some of these units will reach their useful end of life. So again, I actually wait to get those updated inventory numbers. But when you start looking at industry and how do I regulate them and how do I manage a greenhouse gas profile, we've got a couple of things in the works from my regulatory oversight standpoint, and that is maybe looking at ways to cap where we are and not increase at all the amount of greenhouse gases that comes from industry, and then start looking at how the other reduction strategies such as sequestration and the use of EV and EV infrastructure will assist us with that. So just wanted to kind of put that off as an overview, but I'd like to talk a little bit more about EV and EV infrastructure as we move forward.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Brown and Camille, for just helping put us in the right context as we're looking at these strategies in land use, building and housing, and in transportation as well. This helps us alongside all of our viewers understand what are we looking at here? What are the type of solutions? What's the scope that these strategies have on our overall emission profile? But before we move any faster, Camille and Dr. Brown are both members of the Climate Task Force. And as Camille introduced to you all, we have a very broad group of stakeholders together through the Climate Task Force and also through the subgroups that are engaging in this effort. We wanted to bring together such a robust group of members so that we are considering all of the solutions out there. We've taken an approach in the first half of the year to just throw everything on the wall and see what sticks and see what works for Louisiana at the direction of our task force. So Camille and Dr. Brown have been instrumental in that. Camille is also the sector chair for the Land Use, Building and Housing Committee and has done great work leading for them. And so just teeing up the rest of our discussion for today, Camille, I appreciate you taking the overview of this effort and putting in context where we are in the process and with our actions. But to introduce Dr. Brown to you first, and I'll give it back over to him to provide some introductory remarks. But Dr. Chuck Carr Brown became Secretary of the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality in January 1st of 2016. And he had previously served as an Assistant Secretary for Environmental Services in the agency in the early 2000s. So he's a long history working with LDQ, but he left then to start up a successful consulting firm and then returned to LDQ as a service to an old friend and neighbor from his hometown of Amite, our Governor John Bel Edwards. Dr. Brown's insistence on relying on science and following the rules has informed his decision and leadership style over the years. And his forward-looking philosophy has led him to embrace new solutions to old problems, even as he introduced to us a few minutes ago, and we'll further talk through that throughout the rest of this panel. And he believes alternative fuels, conservation, and recycling of resources will sustain the nation's economy as we transition into renewable energy sources. And Dr. Brown has reemphasized the agency's core values, reestablished the Office of Environmental Assessment, and taken a hands-on approach to air quality goals. And Dr. Brown, I'd love to tee it over to you if you have anything else that you'd like to provide for the group as we're beginning our discussion.
Just a couple of quick things. One, as a part of the, I guess, the intricate workings of the task force, there's a lot of models being run, and some of them actually causes me quite a bit of concern in that, you know, some of the inputs basically actually have zero fossil fuels as one of the factors. One has full EV conversion as another factor. But there are lots of models being run that we just, again, as you mentioned, Lindsay, have to understand that there's going to be a sort of a shotgun approach as we narrow down on our target. So overall, when I start looking at an integrated, I guess, alternative fuel future, most folks, especially my counterparts throughout the country, the first question they ask is, well, how do you plan to do that in an oil and gas state? Well, since my first day in office, I've told all of the refinery managers and all the folks in the oil and gas sector, and I make this statement that oil and gas will never go away, but it's not going to be our primary source of energy or electric generation or fuel usage. As a matter of fact, natural gas is going to be, as I mentioned all the time, that natural bridge fuel as we get to where we are and to where we want to go. And so I tell that group of individuals all the time, if I were you, I'd be looking at ways to build a better battery, because in the next 20 to 25 years, we all will be driving electric vehicles. So I've been saying that for the last 5 years. Now, one of the things that does concern me is there are certain things that we have to start right now. As a matter of fact, I think as a part of President Biden's agenda is he wants the state of Louisiana by 2030 to be fully EV converted. As a matter of fact, in order to reach its goals, we're going to have 300,000 electric vehicles by 2030. Well, as we sit here in 2021, there's only 3,000 electric vehicles. We're going to have the infrastructure to service them. And by all calculations, we're going to have to build 4 fast charging stations per day until then, starting last January. So we do have those challenges that we're going to have to deal with in order to at least meet that one particular portion of the president's agenda. Last thing before I turn it back to you, Lindsay, is, there's lots of federal monies that are being pushed down to the states, and a lot of those monies have to be used right now. They want you to have a spending plan. And a part of my agenda would be to look at, of course, increasing the EV infrastructure, electric vehicles in fleets. As a matter of fact, in 2019, I put the first electric vehicle in a state fleet, which is my fleet, the Chevy Bolt. It is the first one in fully electric in a state fleet. I've challenged all my other counterparts and as agency leaders to do the same. If we got large amounts of funding, I would buy those vehicles and put them in the state fleets. Also, we put charging stations in 2 of the state garages. So if anybody out there is in the Galvez or the Sal garage, there's a 4-port charging station in each one of those that you can utilize right now. And of course, Camille talked about mass transit. We have to expand mass transit. I'm working with the folks at Shreveport, which has one of the largest electric bus vehicle fleets in the South. I will be looking to work with CATS here in EBR as a part of our Volkswagen settlement. And we've got to look at expanding mass high-speed rail. That it's a no-brainer. So all those things will be something that if I got an influx of funding, I would absolutely love to put monies into those 4 or 5 things that I just mentioned. So I'll turn it back over to you, Lindsay. Probably a little bit more than you wanted, but at least just putting something out there to spur discussion.
That's great, Dr. Brown. We really appreciate those introductory remarks, and those are great goals to have for using federal funds. Camille, I'd like to turn it over to you now, just to provide your comments and run through these strategies on land use and transportation. But to introduce Camille, she's a native Louisianan and internationally recognized for her expertise in resilience and adaptation planning. Her leadership on issues of land loss, coastal community sustainability, climate change resilience and adaptation, as well as resilience-led community planning, has contributed to the transformations of cities, towns, and parishes throughout Louisiana, and has created knowledge of interest to peers throughout the US and the globe. So as president and CEO, Camille oversees CPEX's multidisciplinary team as they develop plans and provide technical guidance, data and research, policy guidance, communication support, and thought leadership to communities that are seeking to make thoughtful decisions about how they develop and grow. Camille works closely with her board to set organization vision and advance CPEX's mission to bring people and planning together to make a great place. In her previous role as Senior Vice President, Camille guided CPEX's planning and implementation team geared towards developing comprehensive plan, model land use tools, and implementation strategies for more than 30 Louisiana communities. And she built CPEX's coastal resilience line of work by engaging coastal communities and creating a vision for the future of the working coast and developing strategies, programs, and resources needed to make the program progress towards that vision. And Camille also managed CPEX's business development activities and has cultivated strategic relationships with funders, project partners, clients, and stakeholders. So Camille, I think it's very evident through that introduction how you are a relevant and very important partner at this table. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Lindsay. Just to step back a minute, I just want to acknowledge that we're having a discussion about a large body of individuals coming together and having very difficult conversations about the future of our state, not only as we're on the front lines of climate change and responding to those impacts on an annual basis, but also having discussions about major shifts that could occur and will occur in our economy, our workforce. And so these are, you know, we're facing big existential challenges, and these are global challenges, but we are on the front lines here in Louisiana, and it's up to us to secure our future and chart the course that others can follow. I think the changes that need to be made in order to remain economically and socially viable are going to require bold leadership and all hands on deck. And so I'm so proud to be part of this initiative, because we have to set a big table. We have to create space for new partnerships and voices that have not always had a seat at the table in the past. And business as usual is not going to cut it this time. We have to be prepared to do things differently if we want to develop and implement the right strategies for moving our state forward amidst all these immediate and future realities of climate change. And so the Governor's Initiative, Climate Initiatives Task Force is such an important step in the right direction. And as a member, and as Lindsay mentioned, chair of the Land Use Building and Housing Committee, it's exciting to see so many people involved and members of the public providing input. And to speak a little bit, I'm just gonna highlight some of the transportation land use connections, the cross-sector pieces on that. Electrification is critical among these recommendations. It's also one tool that must be accompanied by others if we are to meet emission reductions goals. And so to that end, I want to highlight a few of the recommendations being developed by the task force that will be key to our state's success. And if you could move to the transportation sector strategies. So I'll just quickly hit on a couple. Reduce VMTs. So vehicles miles traveled reduction is going to be critical to reaching any emission reduction goals and an essential component of the climate action plan. Louisiana's annual VMTs has risen dramatically since 2010, and our rate of increase is significantly greater than the national average. So continued growth of VMTs means more emissions and greater demand for electricity in the case of electric vehicles. So if we don't address VMTs, emissions will likely to rise even as fuel economy improves, undermining any gains from other emission reduction strategies. And further, more driving requires more investment in carbon intensive auto infrastructure, roads and highways, cement, tar, and it increases also the heat island effects associated with impervious surfaces, both of which will negatively impact Louisiana's emission reduction goals. Reducing VMTs requires policies, practices, and ultimately behaviors that reduce the number and length of auto trips and shift travel to more efficient modes of transit. Transit such as walking, biking, bus rapid transit. VMT reduction is also best accomplished through a combination of strategic land use planning and transportation pricing. The second piece is expand complete streets implementation. The Department of Transportation and Development, as well as many of our metro areas, have developed and some adopted complete streets policies and are factoring in complete streets metrics into any kind of street improvements or new roads. But the mode shift is essential to reducing VMTs and the associated emissions. Complete streets are essential to facilitating this mode shift because they provide the alternative to automobile travel. Complete street facilities also include the green infrastructure that combats the heat effects and provide carbon sinks. For several decades, streets have been designed to move as many cars as possible, as quickly as possible. And as a result, our transportation infrastructure is ill-suited to the needs of people using other modes of travel. This is especially true in Louisiana. We are the 6th most dangerous state for pedestrians, and the number of pedestrian deaths in our state is trending upward. So shifting our transportation development priorities to focus more holistically on people's mobility needs and preferences is key to providing residents the means to reduce automobile travel and improve the quality of life overall. Creating and strengthening these complete streets policies, not just at the state level, but also at the local level, and in particular at the local level, eliminates conflicts with other transportation and development policies, and expanding funding programs for complete streets implementation are all needed to develop this complete streets infrastructure at the scale required to catalyze meaningful mode shift. The third piece, curb sprawl. I write and talk about this a lot. This goes hand in hand with VMT reduction. In order to reduce our VMTs, more people must have alternatives to long daily commutes. I mean, it's that simple. So by supporting planning and land use decisions that prioritize compact and transit-oriented development, more residents can enjoy the economic and health benefits of reduced VMTs, and all residents can benefit from reduced emissions. And on the, so that's just to name a few of the strategies out of that sector action, the ones that I chose that are directly related to reducing emissions in electric vehicles. If you go back on the slide around land use planning, housing, and buildings, I won't go into all of these, but I'll highlight one of the critical pieces that this committee noted and has been noted in a number of other initiatives. We don't currently have statewide planning capacity or leadership. There's not an overall statewide planning office or entity. And so leadership capacity and guidance at the state level is needed to provide support for the planning strategies and decisions needed to support all of the recommendations I just described, as well as the recommendations that are in this entire land use building and housing framework. So a statewide planning entity would provide resources and expertise, as well as a planning framework that addresses Louisiana's needs and establishes a level playing field across jurisdictions. There's been a lot of recent discussion around the creation of such an office, and I'm hopeful that we will get there. And so that is, if anyone wants to know more about the specific recommendations by either of these sector committees, they can contact me or Lindsay, and we can provide you with what was publicly submitted.
Thank you so much, Camille and Dr. Brown, for providing an overview, a great overview of this effort, and for laying out some initial solutions that are great points of action for Louisiana to start taking as we're considering and beginning this process of developing a climate action plan and addressing our emissions comprehensively. So I'm curious, as we're looking at this overview of the effort, if we take a step back, can you both speak to some of your takeaways from being on the climate task force so far? Have you been surprised to learn anything? Have you found anything particularly interesting? Camille, I will go first to you to address that question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lindsay. I did learn something. So, and not surprising, I learned something new every day, but so when members of the Climate Task Force Committee realized the need for the cross-sector collaboration between committees, because so many of these issues are intertwined and overlapping, Lindsay and her team set up cross-sector meetings. And I attended one of those, which was the issue of power distribution. And it was just such a fascinating discussion because there were so many different groups and perspectives in the room. And from me as a planner, when you're planning cities, the general rule is to develop where there is existing infrastructure. And so you revitalize, adaptive reuse, focus where there's existing infrastructure. And so when we were reminded by members of the Equity Committee that historic decisions about where to locate, potentially hazardous infrastructure have also been prejudiced, and it would be unjust to double down on those decisions without considering the potential to exacerbate, disparities. And so it's not the general rule of thumb of, oh, put the infrastructure where it already exists, because there are people living in really inequitable situations around some of that infrastructure. So while the business as usual approach might suggest that it makes the most sense to build out power distribution facilities where they already exist, in thinking about this power distribution, we must make sure that we understand the equity implications. The burdens and rewards of shifting to clean fuels should be shared equitably. And this is just one of many examples of why setting the inclusive table for these critical decisions is so important. And so that was pretty eye-opening discussion in that committee meeting for me.
Thank you for that, Camille. It was really wonderful to mix up all of our groups. As you ran through earlier, we have 10 different subgroups of the task force. So it's important to understand the interconnectedness between our different sectors, and having those workshops was really helpful on a lot of different fronts. Thank you for that, Camille. And Dr. Brown, do you have any takeaways from the climate task force so far?
Well, thank you, Lindsay. So one of the things, just even building on what Camille just mentioned, is most individuals confuse CO2 emissions with toxic air emissions, and they're not the same. As a matter of fact, CO2 is not regulated, so I'm trying to develop a scheme to actually regulate and enforce, when our standards are not followed. So I do think it is good to include a cross section of individuals. I think that's one of the strengths of the task force. But I also believe in environmental education is what I call it, and that you make sure you're talking about apples to apples and not apples and oranges. And so when we do finally get to a path forward or a final report, everybody has been included in the conversation, because when you start looking at the definition of environmental justice or equity, EPA's definition is basically meaningful input on decisions, and so that in itself says that we've satisfied that definition of equity and environmental justice. So that's one of the things that I am glad that this conversation is being had over a long period of time with a very cross section of individuals. All right.
Thank you for those remarks, Dr. Brown. Camille, a question for you, coming from your background in resilience. The federal infrastructure package has been a large topic of conversation from the administration and Congress over the past couple of months. We've seen a lot of different bills and legislation thrown around at the federal level, but regardless of specific language, I think it's encouraging for this sector to see that we can expect a focus on cleaner transportation. As we talked about in the beginning of this conversation, when we look at the federal level, transportation emissions are the majority of emissions as in the nation. And so we can expect that to be a focus of the infrastructure package. So Camille, I will first ask you, and then Dr. Brown, any additional thoughts you have on looking across these packages. Where do you all see opportunities for Louisiana here through this federal movement?
Yeah, thank you, Lindsay. I am most excited about what we've seen come out of the House in the Invest in America Act. And I should note, Smart Growth America, where I'm a board member, and its affiliate Transportation America, have been leading a lot of work on the Hill, and that is where I get a lot of my information on the forthcoming bills. And so I had a briefing recently on the Biden proposal, the Senate, and now the House. And the House definitely seems most exciting from this discussion perspective. So first, the House bill recognizes that transportation is about people and connecting them to what they need, which is a very welcome departure from the status quo, which focused primarily on just moving cars more quickly and building and expanding out roads to do so. And so to that end, the bill reflects a strong commitment to building out transit infrastructure, which we desperately need. And it's just such a huge opportunity for Louisiana, because if those funds aren't directed towards that build out, it we have so much operations and maintenance work and a backlog of initiatives, and so of projects rather, and so it would be hard to really shift priorities. And so for those resources to come down from the Fed specifically for that, which would be great. But for our cities and regions where workers need better access to job centers, and that might be quite a distance from home, we would be really well served by regional transit and commuter rail service, which is also part of the package. Another priority, which is in the president's bill and also seen in the House bill, is climate resilient infrastructure. And that is, a lot of our infrastructure is over 100 years old. It wasn't built to withstand the new conditions that we have for climate change. And so focusing on a climate resilient infrastructure with, one such infrastructure is the network of EV charging stations across the country. So the sooner we invest in that infrastructure needed to facilitate our shift to clean energy, the less costly it will be to manage, climate change impacts and meet our mitigation goals. And lastly, I'll mention accountability. The House version of the bill includes important accountability measures for performance of these investments. And so this should be a transformative investment in our country, and creating and tracking the right metrics to ensure that the resources are actually increasing access to jobs and services for those who need them most is essential. So I'm really excited about this bill in particularly. I know, there's going to be a combination that comes out in the end, but it would be very welcome for, I know, from Louisiana's cities and parishes perspective.
Those are great points to raise. Dr. Brown, any additions to make to that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the EV infrastructure, right now in Louisiana, there's roughly 130, 140 charging stations as a part of the Volkswagen settlement. We're going to put another 34 through our round 2 funding. And then I'm looking at another maybe 50 through our round 3 funding. And to be honest with you, when you start looking at an individual that buys an electric vehicle, they do most of their charging at home. But right now, as we currently stand, there's absolutely no reason why an individual couldn't buy an electric vehicle and function just like they would had they had a vehicle that ran on fossil fuels. So if increasing in EV infrastructure, I would increase the number of vehicles in the state fleets. It's sort of a no-brainer. Of course, I would promote, as Camille mentioned, commuter transit, high-speed rail. All those things can be done quickly. And then just to talk a little bit about resilience. From my seat, resilience is something that I already incorporate into permitting. So there's some strategies that say if we stay in our current status or do nothing state, that you could actually draw a line straight down I-10 east and west throughout the state line, and everything except New Orleans will be underwater in 30 years because we built a levee around that city. But everything else would be underwater south of I-10. So you can imagine that all the infrastructure that's in Lafayette right now would now be in Opelousas. And you'd have to adjust the way that you deal with society in general, having to live with water. But from a resiliency standpoint, I've already built that into our permitting. I've got 4 or 5 things on my list that I would spend monies that came to address climate from the federal government, and we're watching closely. So I would agree that Camille and I are on the same page.
That's great to hear, Dr. Brown. And you mentioned the VW mitigation settlement, and you were instrumental in leading work through the mitigation fund in Louisiana to purchase cleaner burning vehicles for school boards across Louisiana, among a lot of other things that came from that settlement. So what did you and DEQ learn through that settlement and the rollout of alternative fuel vehicles? And then how can we apply that in Louisiana through lessons learned if we do receive more funding around clean transportation at the federal level?
Well, thanks for that also. So one thing that you learn is you're certainly not an island. Okay, so whatever we do here in Louisiana, I've got to be able to cross into Mississippi and do the same thing. I got to be able to cross into Texas and do the same thing. So just for a little background, in 2015, Volkswagen settled with the federal government for 4.3 billion, 4.3 billion. And based on the number of diesel powered vehicles you had in your state at your time, you got your pro rata share. Well, Louisiana's share was about 20 million. To put that in perspective, California got 400 million. But you would think that the 20 million that we got was 400 million, because I got suggestions from all over the country as to what we need to do with that money. Well, one of the things we decided to do, DEQ being the lead agency in conjunction with DNR and DOTD, is we retrofitted or bought new vehicles for DOTD, took old diesel vehicles out of service, brought in high efficiency diesel. We offered RFP and RFQs to local school boards in our first round of funding. And overall, if they were to replace old diesel buses with alternative fuel buses, whether it be electric, compressed natural gas, hydrogen, or propane, then we would pay a share, if not 100%. So having said that, we bought over 400 buses for 10 or 12 school systems throughout the state that are now using alternative fuel buses. We also, again, have enhanced the EV infrastructure. As a matter of fact, if you look at my third round, we're going to be giving monies to Breck, Katz, City of Baton Rouge, Denham Springs, LSU, and Southern University, just in the EBR area, to enhance our EV infrastructure. Again, we applied to the Federal Highway Administration to create alternative fuel corridors. So if you drive I-10, I-20 east and west, I-49 north and south, or I-10 east and west, state line to state line, you'll see these nice blue signs that tell you you can get propane, you can charge up, you can get CNG, and exit here, just like they have the gasoline symbol. So we've started. I'm in conversations with my counterparts, again, in Texas, Arkansas, and Mississippi, because I also need to be able to charge up when I get to Jackson, Mississippi. I also need to charge up when I get to Dallas, Texas. So Volkswagen is work for us. We're in our third round now, actually wrapping up the final distribution, which has a large chunk of roughly 2 million for EV infrastructure. Right?
That's wonderful to hear, Dr. Brown. Thank you for your leadership in distributing those funds and all the work that you have done in expanding EV infrastructure across Louisiana. And those are great priorities for us to keep in mind as we are looking towards the federal infrastructure packages and other opportunities with this administration. And both of you had mentioned tying climate to resilience a couple of times. So I thought it would be helpful for us to circle back to a question around that. Obviously, the governor's coastal team is running point on the Climate Initiatives Task Force, and we have a long history rooted in resilience and adaptation to climate change, but have begun to go into the mitigation space, seeing that we can't just adapt our way out of the climate crisis. We do need to mitigate our emissions as well. And so I'm curious from both of you, how can we develop mitigation actions in the transportation and in the land use sectors that also improve our resilience and help us adapt better to the impacts of climate change? How do we really maximize those co-benefits through the work that we're doing here?
So let me start, and then Camille can pick up what I leave. So, as I went to Lake Charles after Hurricane Laura, of course, all of the power poles were blown down, and of course, all we did was reconstruct them in the same manner. We didn't build back smarter. Okay, when it comes to resilience, everything tells you don't put another wooden pole back up, build all of the transmission underground. When you talk about encouraging smart development, one of the things that I've done with every local government that I've come in contact with, and you talk about resilience, is when you approve or through your planning commission a new neighborhood development, one of those lots need to be left empty. That is a solar panel field that powers that subdivision. And therefore you are not relying on an antiquated system to give you power. And when you are faced with tornado, hurricane, whatever the case may be, you're almost self-contained because you've got your own power generation through one empty lot. So some of the developers like that idea, but they want some incentive. If you remember, there was a green bill lead initiative. And so it added $1 or $2 extra $1,000 to the price of the house that had to be sold. So these developers and these builders wanted to have some incentive in order to leave that one lot empty. But I think that's something that we can always work around. When it comes to what I do from a permitting realm is if you want to build right now on Louisiana's coast, you got to build with your generators above ground level. You got to build that can withstand 150-mile-an-hour winds. If you've got infrastructure on a bottom floor, that bottom floor has to be collapsible and cleaned out and put back into commerce quickly. So it's just a matter of how you bounce back from these events. And if there's a request to build a wastewater treatment plant below I-10, then I've got to have good justification, because that once they go underwater, then you're dealing with environmental issues. So those are the questions that I'm asking now, looking at how we build smarter and how we can recover quickly. And that's sort of how I build in resiliency and what I'm doing.
That's wonderful to hear, Dr. Brown, and a great cross between the transportation and the land use components that we've been discussing today. Camille, any additions to Dr. Brown?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that those were great concrete examples. I'll just say that getting back to my points and connecting it to the biggest impediment to resilience in Louisiana, which is poverty. Investing in multimodal transportation networks and shifting our land use towards more compact development, it helps build resilience by addressing factors that contribute to poverty and racial, economic, and health disparities. And so these actions can help low-income residents reduce their housing and transportation expenses, access more opportunities for jobs and training, and engage in healthier behaviors on a daily basis. I think that is where we should be focused in one light. Another piece is these actions also build resilience by reducing impervious surfaces and preserving green space, both of which help reduce flood risk. So resilience in the state of Louisiana, you know, it's trickier because we are at a tipping point for the constellation of issues around climate risk being, you know, annual. We're seeing it, we're feeling it, we're on the front lines, but we're also, you know, the economic stratification and poverty issues here are also, you know, exacerbated by those climate impacts. And then the current layout and build out of our infrastructure isn't conducive to flood risk reduction and the future needs for climate resilient infrastructure. So yeah, that's.
And let me add one other quick thing to that, in that everywhere I go, you know, I talk about electric vehicles, but you know, there's got to be an aftermarket protocol, because a lot of folks, to Camille's point, have never even bought a brand new vehicle. So the last thing that they're going to do is buy a brand new electric vehicle. So we have to understand that there is a disparity, and that has to be addressed if we're going to bring our entire society into this solution to the problem that we're going to have. Right.
Thank you, Dr. Brown, for those comments, and Camille as well. I appreciate the great action ideas that you all have presented here related to resilience and federal infrastructure in the task force more broadly. And as Camille overviewed earlier in the climate timeline, as we're moving forward throughout this summer, we'll be taking all of these great action ideas in land use, in transportation, and starting to think really comprehensively about these components that Dr. Brown and Camille just mentioned. How do we make these solutions equitable? How do we ensure that they are financially accessible across groups of people? How do we cite infrastructure in a way that accounts for and understands the people of Louisiana? And so as we're moving throughout this process, we'll have a lot of great time and a lot of great discussion the second half of the year as we're beginning to put together what the action ideas and the strategies look like for Louisiana in our climate action plan. So I appreciate the great ideas and remarks that both of you have presented today in our discussion. And with that, Anne, I'd like to hand it back over to you to bring us into our Q&A time.
Sure, I'm also gonna pull up some slides that we'll be going over shortly. All right, I'm sorry, let me get to here. All right, can you all, oh, it shares paused, of course, so we'll reshare. It doesn't like it when you put things full screen. Okay, fantastic. We do have a question in the Q&A that I'd like to give a stab at answering. It says, who is DEQ partnering with to build out the EV charging station infrastructure? And I wanted to let y'all know that Louisiana Clean Fuels and the Southeast Louisiana Clean Fuel Partnership have been working hand in hand with the DEQ on a lot of these proposals, helping as technical advisors. And each recipient is responsible for selecting their own contractors and installing their own charging, but we are acting as advisors for each of those recipients to help walk them through the process and make it as easy for them as possible. Dr. Brown, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's exactly what I was going to say. I mean, we don't pick contractors, but we work with a lot of municipalities. Again, I just mentioned a bunch of even some transportation entities. We will be looking to work with CLECO as they put up some of their own monies to help complete some of these corridors. But mainly, we don't do anything with who's actually doing the work. I will say that normally the way these charging stations work is you just pay to park and you kind of charge up while you park. And so, but no, that we don't pick contractors. So thank you.
All right, awesome. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Okay, so we're going to move on. I have just a really quick few slides for everyone before we completely wrap up. This and all webinars under the Clean Fuel Summit will be saved on the Louisiana Clean Fuels YouTube channel. You can go back and look at past webinars if you're interested in all the challenges that we're going to be facing for heavy duty electrification and all the preparation that utilities and larger fleets are going to need to go through. We have a great series, the multi-port megawatt charging systems, and we have all sorts of other resources. But we've been talking a lot about resilience and electric vehicles today, and that brings me to our next presentation today, which is at 3 p.m., and it is planning for resiliency, electric fleets, electric vehicles and public fleets. And so we have Entergy and FreeWire and another fellow Clean Cities coordinator who will all be having a roundtable discussion moderated by Jared Schneider of CalSTART, where we're going to be discussing some of these issues in depth. Now, we're not looking at, the large heavy duty fleets right now, but we will cover some of those topics if someone has questions. So please join us again at 3 p.m. for this discussion. Thank you so much for y'all's time today. I know it was a little wonky, but boy, we got through this smooth sailing. And thank you all so much. Thank you, Lindsay, Camille, and Dr. Brown. We love having you all and would love to have you all again in the future. And our next Clean Fuel Summit in the fall is going to be fall of 2022 is going to be in person. So we look forward to seeing you all and getting a chance to network with you all again. And again, thank you to our corporate sponsor who helped us out with this session, and it is Entergy. And again, we look forward to seeing you all at 3 p.m. Thanks to everyone.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye.